With horns, huge back protrusions, and above all else its signature bladed tail, Glavenus is one of the most recognisable brutes and monsters. The bulls especially have the classic brute wyvern belligerence, but are also known for their cunning and dexterity compared to their relatives. So let's take a look at their ecology, behaviour and life history to uncover the secrets of the swordtail. Glavenus is known as one of the more bad-tempered brutes, and there's numerous behavioural reasons for this aggression, but one could be that he's just not getting a good night's sleep, so maybe he should try a manta sleep mask. Manta sleep make the best sleep masks for comfort and variety, so you can get better sleep and especially better naps. Having actually used them myself, Manta sleep masks are both very comfortable and do an excellent job at blocking out light and other external influences for you to sleep at any time. So if you're anything like me and don't have the best sleep hygiene, then they're ideal in removing blinking lights or temptations to check your phone. This makes them ideal for flights, trains and other travel too. There's the standard mask, the cool mask, the steam mask, the weighted mask, the super soft silk mask, and best of all, the Bluetooth mask, so you can let me drone you to sleep at night. You can follow the link provided now and in the description, and use my code UHC for 10% off, so you can finally get a good night's sleep. So with that out of the way, what is the deal with the tail of the Glavenus? The caudal region of the animal has clearly undergone extensive biomineralization, with the ventral edge forming a clear blade and much of the rest of the tissue being covered in metal too. So obviously, why? And the most likely answer when nature starts getting all weird about things is sexual selection. Glavenus bulls trying to outdo other Glavenus bulls, so Glavenus females pick them. So then, what aspects is Glavenus actually showing off with his huge bladed tail? And a big one may be the quality of its territory and the ability to locate ore. The Iceborne lorebook does state that bull Glavenus sweep their tails on the ground to accumulate minerals, and especially iron, for both the colour and the overall appearance. Iron is seemingly blue in the world of Monster Hunter. Why Glavenus doesn't go for harder ores could be as it eats these instead. Whilst it may decorate the tail with iron, the tail still has to be grown and maintained through the Glavenus's life, so ostensibly they have to eat considerable amounts of minerals to do this. Matcholite and other such ores may be used for the initial construction of the tail, and as well as other things, the tail may also function as a billboard for the health of the Glavenus male and its ability to maintain itself too. But either way, it needs sufficient amounts of said minerals to grow a suitably impressive tail. Using a secondary characteristic to display certain attributes you possess is fairly common, and the quality of some bird territories, where food was used to measure quality, can accurately be measured by the vocal output and consistency of their songs, which is presumably what the females do when picking a suitable mate. But why is Glavenus showing off how much ore he has in his territory of all things? And this may be their indicator of territory quality. Soil composition is important to ecosystem productivity, with mafic rocks like basalt often breaking down into rich soils with high ecosystem productivity, and felsic rocks like granite often breaking down into sandy, nutrient-poor soils with low ecosystem productivity. This may be one of the top things a Glavenus displays with its tail, and may be a convincing factor for a female to mate with that male, and then stay in his territory to rear her offspring. This may be especially prevalent in the desert population of Glavenus, in sandy, low-productivity areas where richer soils with more minerals will be at an absolute premium. So with the tail being the essential tool in wooing females, it's no wonder the males maintain them fastidiously. Glavenus regularly scrape their tails clean with their jaws, presumably in response to both general crap accumulating, but also the iron or other decorative mineral rusting or dulling and making the male seem less attractive. The skull of the male Glavenus has unsurprisingly undergone notable changes, and is significantly covered in plate-like armour to protect the soft tissues from both sparks and the bladed edge of the tail. Especially prevalent are the 4 large and heavily mineralized oral plates, that are the parts that interact with the tail itself, being heavily reinforced and presumably to prevent Glavenus wearing its teeth down too quickly. Anything scraped free from the tail is swallowed and stored in the bursa, a sac in Glavenus's throat that seems to be a general store for waste products, until they can be combusted and used in conflict. But as well as display, Glavenus will ostensibly swing its tail at things with hostile intent. And as well as for cleaning, a Glavenus sharpening its tail is also a clear threat display. Bull Glavenus compete fiercely for ore in females, but may not necessarily open with the nuclear option, and potentially like Anjanath have a series of escalating threats and stages before the tails are used. Glavenus still has strong jaws, with a heavily armoured head and a pair of horns too. If a shouting match and tail display fails, bulls may resort to locking horns and testing their strength on one another in an honest and reasonably safe contest. If all that fails, things may then get dangerous. Glavenus may well use their tails against each other, but not in a fair sparring match. Despite their willingness to slap the hunter with them, Glavenus may be cautious on using their tails on just anything. The hunter is a gnat in comparison, and Glavenus outweighs many opponents it does use its tail on that aren't especially heavily armoured. Similarly, the substrate of most environments isn't likely to be harder than the tail itself either, but another Glavenus tail would be its equal. So if Glavenus don't just try to engage with lethal body strikes, they may rather try to strike at the base of their opponent's tail. Important muscles for coordination and movement like the M. femoralis are present here, and a good hit may result in blood loss and crippling wounds. In some cases, Glavenus may even sever the tail tips of their opponents. Like many monsters with important secondary sexual characteristics, Glavenus' reproductive success may be tied to the tail, and one without it has no chance of securing a mate. If one bull severs its opponent's tail tip, they don't have to kill them. They're no longer part of the competition. Some may be surprised as to why Glavenus doesn't use its tail in attacks versus opponents more, but it's pretty important to remember Glavenus still has two weapons, one of which is still a powerful set of jaws. It's not going to cut off its nose to spite its face for the sake of using its tail. And such interactions are not always good opportunities. Glavenus turning to use its tail against a charging Diablos just presents its flank or rear to the Diablos, and risks it getting gored rather than sidestepping to use its jaws. In a turf war that may well be an overambitious failed predation attempt over a competitive interaction. Similarly, Diablos is a huge and well-armoured opponent that could well risk damaging the tail if swung at it. In another conflict, Odogaron gets first blood and attacks the head of the Glavenus, making it the natural choice to start mauling it in return. When Odogaron repels Glavenus and creates space, Glavenus then uses the space to bring in its tail, only for Odogaron to dodge. Glavenus only uses the tail against Rathian in both encounters, as there is already sufficient space between them for it to get a swing in. Glavenus bulls in general can be something of a hazard, not only being dangerous themselves, but also stirring the pot with other monsters, putting everyone on edge due to frequent conflict and making local areas risky indeed. Despite this, Glavenus may not be subject to similar ire as Deviljho, as it can function as something of a truffle hog to the guild. Consider what huge business mining is, both in our world and especially in the world of Monster Hunter, and Glavenus may well be useful indeed for finding ore deposits outside of volcanic regions. Enough so not to have a shoot-on-sight policy at least. Glavenus is generally well matched against other large predators, and for the most part has little to fear when a healthy adult. Like many other predators, it may also eliminate competition when the opportunity arises, and the first individual slain by the Sapphire Star did seem to have picked up on a wounded Rathian to follow it back to the nest. Had the hunter not awoken the flying wyvern, Glavenus may well have had a reasonable shot at an ambush. Otherwise, even the smaller Rathian can still put up a fair fight, and considering the high overlap the two have in territories, and Rathian's natural hostility to Glavenus, it could be that Glavenus raid the nests of singleton Rathians whenever they get the chance to. As Glavenus seems to occupy a wide range of territories, chiefly forests, deserts, and volcanic regions, it's well suited to hot conditions especially, and the giant structures on the back serve as thermal windows for Glavenus. Like the horns of desert bighorn and Ural sheep that can actually have considerable thermoregulatory ability, the heat stacks on Glavenus are likely well-vascularized structures, and not just keratinous or similarly dead tissue. If broken or attacked, a Glavenus risks serious injury and blood loss. Such strong importance of thermoregulation suggests Glavenus first evolved in a hot environment, but Glavenus's presence in forests and deserts is especially interesting, as they're not especially ore-rich regions. Few are compared to the volcanic belt in the Old World and the Elder's Recess in the New World. Whilst it's unknown if female Glavenus can bear young in the volcanic regions, due to the challenge it is for other still generally pretty heat-resistant species, and so with little territorial resource to show off to female Glavenus, the reason for the bulls being in the volcano could be for the minerals and ore, over claiming it as a permanent territory. It could be subadult Glavenus bulls make a pilgrimage to the volcano to feed on and generally sequester sufficient ore until full maturity, and then return to their natal biome to carve out a territory for themselves. The volcano may in a way be the bulls' home away from home out of the breeding season too, and whilst vacant for said season, when everyone returns there may be a fresh round of conflict to see who gets the best mining spots, with the largest, most skilled and dominant bulls returning to successfully claim the same patch each year. And when a successful male has claimed a territory and repelled the other hopefuls, the females are all his, and the breeding ground of one male is sometimes sufficiently large to be utilised by several females. Glavenus bulls take no part in the child rearing, but do stick around until the egg is laid in a behaviour known as mate guarding, essentially following your partner around to make sure no one else mates with them, and so the offspring are definitely yours. For Glavenus bulls with multiple females, doing strenuous laps of their territory to try and check in on each individual female may well be an exhausting task that takes precedence over foraging, as well as risking genetic cuckoldry in the greedy pursuit of multiple mates. As said, female Glavenus judge a male based on the tail, and this may begin even before they meet. Indeed, for Glavenus, it may well be love at first smell. Glavenus bulls will extensively mark their territories with tail sweeps, leaving behind both the trace excretions used to grow and maintain the tail, as well as traces of its metal composition and decoration. From this, both female and other Glavenus bulls can tell a lot about another male, his claimed territory, and quite literally what he's made of. The frequency of this action, plus Glavenus itself digging for minerals, also means it engages extensively in biotubation, fixing nitrogen, mixing the soil, and even depositing trace minerals to enrich the composition too. So despite the occasional forest fire in the dry season, that are beneficial if only occasional anyway, Glavenus enriches the areas they frequently patrol for new plant and fungal growth. Interestingly, Glavenus females only lay a single egg, that's described as hatching quickly after it's laid, and this may be an example of facultative viviparity. In some tortoise species in abnormally hot summers, the females won't lay and bury eggs as normal, but rather keep the offspring developing inside the ovaries until they're at the stage of development that would be ready for hatching. The egg is then laid without burial and the offspring hatch shortly after. The tortoise in question being the angulate tortoise, which also lays multiple one-egg clutches a year too, more similar to Glavenus. The reason such things occur is believed to be so the mother can provide better incubation conditions for her offspring, and this would fit with what we know about the environment Glavenus lives in. Hot deserts and volcanoes may well be poor conditions to lay eggs, and other heat-tolerant wyverns like Rathian can't reproduce in a volcanic area, despite occasionally being seen there too. Similarly, volcanic regions in particular may have sulfuric gases and other fumes that would suffocate chicks in their porous shells before they even hatch. Rather, the mother Glavenus keep their eggs developing inside them before the final days prior to hatching, when she lays. There are costs to this. Carrying around a large egg for some time will be expensive. The mother's mobility is impaired, and the female Glavenus will have to work extra hard to keep her body cool and toxin-free to keep the egg in good order. Thus, she likely shares the heat stacks of the bull Glavenus, and they may even be proportionally larger. It's also a risk if the mother is attacked or killed too. but as a large and powerful wyvern, female Glavenus, even at the terminal stage of development, may be immune to most attackers, and flee from those who still pose a threat. The fact it's a single egg may also have some influence here, and it may just be a safer option for the mother to keep it with her for as long as possible, rather than leaving it for any length of time while she has to go and engage in other tasks, like acquiring food and water. Due to the fact she only has one offspring in a limited seasonal window, may mean she can't afford to lose a clutch as readily as other species. All of this may suggest to very large eggs in female Glavenus. A single egg with an advanced development time is seen in a few other species, and can lead to some huge eggs. Kiwis are well known for this, and can have eggs around a quarter of the mother's body mass. European storm petrels can take things even further, and have eggs close to a third of the mother's body mass. And some skinks can also have huge single eggs too, so it isn't just birds. It's unknown if female Glavenus reach quite the same extreme levels, but it could be possible they have the largest eggs to body mass of any wyvern, and still have a notable egg size. In kiwis at least, it's due to the chicks being precocious. On hatching, the chicks are large, have a stomach full of yolk, and are generally ready to roll, though they still get parental care. This is likely the same for a hatchling Glavenus, who presumably hatch large, mobile, and ready to keep up with the mother, to start learning the trade secrets of being a Glavenus. Such a huge egg can be expensive though, and as suggested likely puts a notable physiological strain on the mother, especially in the final stages of development. Not just for growing it and keeping it cool, safe and fed, but also the notable movement costs carrying it around with you for every journey you have too. In the storm petrels, first-time mothers can have reduced survival due to this huge burden, and it may well be the same for first-time Glavenus mothers as well, especially those who may not have established territories. But when the baby is hatched, a brand new series of challenges begin when the mother has to rear her offspring to roughly passable level before it's on its own. Having one offspring isn't necessarily easy, and Glavenus have a high rate of parental investment with just a single chick, and only one egg in a select season. Plus, Glavenus mothers have a lot to teach. It's mentioned that Glavenus chicks learn their tail skills and hunting behaviour from their mother, which fits as such specialised behaviours are typically passed down the matriline. One of the researchers in Celeana wonders if Glavenus tail use is taught, and if they have a notion of tool use. And whilst the latter is questionable, as it's still a part of their body, it does seem Glavenus inherit their tail knowledge from their mother, and this can roughly line up with Glavenus having a culture. Culture in animals is defined as the inheritance of an array of behavioural traditions through social learning from others, and this seems to fit the bill. So Glavenus may actually behave in different ways depending on where they're raised, and who by, as different environmental pressures may give different challenges for them to overcome as a species, from ore locations to environmental hazards to a difficult prey too. There may be some evidence for this in extinct theropod dinosaurs too, and results from stable isotope analysis in their teeth showed some individuals had distinct prey choices atypical to others. While female Glavenus may inherit or claim territory reasonably close to their mothers, and the bulls are likely the long-distance dispersers, it may be that Glavenus stay or return to the biome in which they were born, due to familiarity with it, even if they return to areas considerable distance from their natal areas, which would expect to avoid inbreeding, due to their experience with it and key lessons taught to them being applicable there. In Glavenus, specialised behaviours would be passed down via the mothers, and so female Glavenus are the primary teachers and spreaders of culture. This could also mean there's little admixture or shared information between populations, and Glavenus may be similar to Tigrex in that it could potentially have several technical subspecies with little mixing, or be one massive population where occasional individual bulls, keen on much further dispersal, keep good rates of admixture between geographic locations, and behave more as environment generalists. At any rate, it likely means on an individual level, there may be a lot of differences in how individual Glavenus do things, and all of this may affect motherhood too. Whilst described as laying one egg per breeding season, there may be differing levels on how long Glavenus mothers spend nurturing their chick. Leopards have a range of ages they can boot their cubs out at, from just 7 to 36 months. For the most part, as a species, leopards seem to prefer focusing on the cubs they do have at the time, rather than trying to maximise fecundity by having more cubs quickly. Similarly, in periods of low prey availability, mother leopards will keep their cubs around longer until conditions have improved. So maybe Glavenus is in a similar boat, and it may come down to personal preference and environment. In the lush, prey-filled ancient forest and Jurassic frontier, Mother Glavenus may keep their chicks with them for a comparatively short time, and teach them the basics before letting them loose in a relatively productive environment where they have good chances of making it on their own. But in volcanic or desert regions, female Glavenus may keep their offspring close for far longer to buffer them against harsh environmental conditions and make sure they learn as many tricks of the trade as possible. The locations of waterholes and ore veins, migration routes, and how to handle other monsters could all be vital skills for these harsher environments, and it could even be some Glavenus mothers may skip an annual breeding season in favour of focusing on their current chick, especially if conditions are bad, and also especially if it's a male. One thing sometimes seen in relatively high parental investments is that males often get more attention. They often grow and mature slower or get larger than the females, and benefit more from the extra care. As well as this, it also improves a mother's lifetime fitness due to having a better, stronger son, is likely to give her more grandchildren. So beneath it all, Glavenus are likely mama's boys. It's unknown if there's much sexual size dimorphism in Glavenus, but with the importance of the tail to males especially, as well as the importance of early life care in males, this would still fit overall. This paints an overall picture of Glavenus as something with a relatively slow reproductive rate, and whilst this may seem extreme, unlikely, or even impossible for such an animal in such a competitive environment, there's examples of animals with similarly slow reproduction for their niche. Ground hornbills are slow to mature. They need considerable practice as a helper at the nest before they learn enough to have their own offspring, and as adults they only fledge a single chick on average every 9 years. But despite living in a world of lions, leopards and eagles, it took human development to start threatening them as a species. So Glavenus taking life in the slow lane doesn't seem so unreasonable for a monster in an arguably better position. With all the talk of different cultures of Glavenus, it's worth bringing up where acidic Glavenus fit in, and how they wound up in the Vale and how this affects their unique ecology. How Glavenus handle the effluvium is interesting, and also the reason for the crystalline coating on their tail. Acidic Glavenus's general presence in the Vale results in them ingesting effluvium, that when in combination with water breaks down into the acid, as seen in the luminous pools in the pit of the Vale. The Glavenus rather excretes this toxic waste product along the tail, resulting in it becoming covered in the caustic crystals, and this is likely a typical Glavenus trait. Glavenus has adaptations for living in volcanic regions, and may well have to filter toxic compounds and poisonous gases emitted in such areas. Sulfur dioxide is the most common one, but there are plenty more, as well as heavy metals. In short, Glavenus has a lot to process through living in such areas. This likely also explains Uragan speciating into Radoban too. Uragan may well have a similar set of adaptations to handle toxic volcanic gases in its typical home, that similarly allowed it to withstand the effluvium and successfully radiate into the Vale. So with this, it somewhat changes the display function of Glavenus's tail. It's no longer a billboard for its territory, but is chiefly a display of immunofunction in acidic Glavenus bulls, and this is often a trait of various display features. Brightness of plumage in some birds, or tusk length in elephants for example, are thought to be linked to immune functioning and the health of the animal. Glavenus bulls may well walk around with their tail covered in the crystals, as a clear display of how good they are at filtering them from their body, how fit they are overall, and that all these genes are up for grabs if you mate with them. It's also possible that the extra weight of the crystals is a further flex, and that Glavenus only shave their tails for certain tasks like combat. The ore and territory aspect may become less relevant to acidic Glavenus, due to the environmental conditions. 1. There's food everywhere, and 2. There's effluvium everywhere. Territory quality is less meaningful when resources are everywhere, and immune functioning is the more important display when there's flesh-eating bacteria everywhere. So Glavenus bulls have shifted the function of their tails to display more relevant evolutionary traits in the Vale. But what changes may females be under pressure to make in the Vale? And a lot of the initial traits that are useful in other locations can be useful here too. It's possibly more important than ever for the mother to keep the egg inside her until the chick is ready due to the effluvium, and thus could be even more important she pick a good bull with good filtering abilities, as well as having them herself. It could even be possible they get some form of limited exposure to effluvium in utero to begin developing resistance. The egg is likely laid in the upper reaches of the Vale to give the chick a softer start to things, and allow it to begin building effluvium resistance in the less infested parts of the Vale. But their existence may be a tenuous one until the chick is an adult. The prime fresh carrion in the upper reaches may well attract large and dangerous competitors, like Odogaron, Tigrex and Deviljho, that would kill Glavenus chicks if given the opportunity. It could be possible after hatching the mother and chick immediately descend into the lower reaches of the Vale, with the chick lasting off its yolk reserves for the initial leg to try and avoid larger predators. Mother and baby may well undergo regular micro-migrations up and down the lower reaches of the Vale, entering the upper levels to feed on the higher quality food and water and avoid effluvium, but hastily descending when a significant competitor shows up. Another reason why effluvium resistance is so important. Bull Glavenus aren't nearly so concerned with the threat of intraguild predation, and wander where they please in the Vale, assuming they still have set breeding seasons like their normal cousins, meaning they don't have to follow females out of the season. Overall, acidic Glavenus likely live considerably more sedentary lives in the Vale compared to their higher ground cousins, not having to travel hugely far for both food and water, and so possibly living at higher densities in smaller territories. Clearly, competition still occurs on both intra- and interspecific levels. Glavenus bulls will still compete for females, and Glavenus is still aggressive to the fanged wyverns of the Vale like Odogaron and Great Gyros. As suggested in Odogaron's video, even if much of the Vale's inhabitants have resistance to effluvium, there may still be a strong preference for fresh windfalls due to the mineral, nutrients and water content over the effluvium-riddled biltong of the lower levels, that may lead to confrontations in the upper levels over food. Both species may be considerable threats to Glavenus chicks too. It's one thing to defend yourself and quite another your vulnerable offspring. Interestingly too, the lack of bursa attacks in acidic Glavenus may suggest that even with their resistance, the concentrated acid is too toxic or corrosive to be held for long periods in its unfiltered form. Overall, compared to the hammer and anvil of other giant brutes like Deviljho, Uragan and Duramboros, Glavenus is the scalpel, with a unique fastidiousness in much of its ecology not seen in the other brute wyverns. With a surprisingly broad range, yet with only a fraction of the hostility shown to Deviljho despite its belligerence, Glavenus is here to stay as one of the top predators of the old and new world alike. So for my thoughts on Glavenus, I don't hate it despite what some may fear. I like it more than I dislike it, and I think it's a fairly good monster. It's definitely not my favourite brute, and the finished design is a little bit busy, a little bit spiky, and a little bit of a late-gen portable design. But again, it's still more good than bad. The Iceborne book also did a good job retconning some of Glavenus's more excessive features into practical uses that made me appreciate it more too. In general, I think Iceborne Glavenus is quite good. It seems to divide most people into two camps that either think it's the best rendition so far or utterly ruined, and I'm in the former camp. I also think Acidic was a great, reasonable subspecies that fits nicely and has perhaps even a better fight. It's also really nice to get a properly endemic subspecies too, rather than just adding to Iceborne's roster bloat. And Acidic is nicely at home in the Vale. I also thought he was much better than Hellblade too. who was one of the midder deviants, and effectively just Glavenus but slightly more an anime. I also thought Glavenus and especially Hellblade's animations could be especially unconvincing in GU, and really made him look too light, springy, and thus artificial for something so huge too, even if he is meant to have canonically very strong legs. One thing that does annoy me is how long his tail takes to break. It can often feel like he's one hit away from death once you succeed in doing so, and it does make him feel like a bit of a developer pet. Despite some being as dependent on their appendages for their fight as Glavenus is with his tail, no one else seems to get the same treatment, and I also think having Glavenus change its fight after the tail break could be a good indicator of its intelligence, better than saying trust us he just is. Having it recognise it lost an appendage and altering its movements accordingly would be a fair display of cognition, especially if it found a way to utilise the cut tail piece too. I also don't think Glavenus's theme suits him very well. It's not bad battle game music, but it doesn't hit as hard as the other Monster Hunter tracks, and especially not for flagship monsters, especially when the rest of the Fated Fours are just perfect for them, whereas Glavenus just sounds a little generic, and not like it's made for this massive brute wyvern. I'm a little curious about what they'll do in future. Glavenus is a pretty high-profile monster, and it's surprising that he has a subspecies limited to just two maps. Whether he'll get the treatment of some other monsters and get a dozen different variants, or if they'll show restraint, we'll just have to see. I think an interesting alternative would have been one more like some of his concept art pieces, which I generally really like with its somewhat more restrained design. And especially the idea of Boneblade Glavenus does fit. Glavenus was made as the monster equivalent of the Greatsword, and this would be the perfect variant to parallel the metal-bone weaponry split too. I do also think Boneblade is roughly what Glavenus may have looked like a few 100,000 or million years ago too. I think Glavenus may have the least potential of the Fated Four to flesh out his other half though. I think it'd be very cool to see official artwork or a cutscene or something of a female Glavenus. But given how they're not so different from the males, I don't think there'd be a massively interesting or different fight. Seasonally, I think Glavenus doesn't have huge amounts to do either, but it'd be nice if he was only a seasonal variant in deserts and jungles for mating, and I really don't think Glavenus needs to be in any more biomes too. Though Glavenus himself could be fleshed out a little bit more with the culture aspect. If they have the jungle, desert and volcano individuals have different moves, or made them low, high and master rank respectively, to try and reflect some difference in behaviours. So it turns out I had a lot more to say on Glavenus than I first thought. And as for Abiorogu, more like Abiorogu, classic. But seriously, even the Frontier worshippers seem to dislike him. Anyway, thanks for watching, and thanks to top patron Phenomenon for their generosity in supporting the channel, as well as Case Sandom, Big Al, Erengar Steiny, Flygon's Archives, Sassy Birdo, Inventory Overflow, Tristan Berry, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Seth Fake Last Name, Zaysir, Carazol, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakuhatsu Bakumatsu for their ongoing kindness keeping the channel going. If you're interested in doing so too, there's a link to the Patreon in the description, and I appreciate any amount. Thanks as ever to Kamen Rider Moten for both the digital artwork of Glavenus doing Glavenus things, as well as the close-up shots of its anatomy for inspection. For more of her artwork, be sure to follow her on social media, where they produce plenty of content independent of my videos. And thanks to artist I Am the Kaijuking for creating the excellent Glavenus skull for this video. It's one of his personal favourites. For more skulls, artwork and original creations, be sure to follow him on Tumblr, and if you can, support him on Patreon too, with links to both provided in the description. Thanks to Glyde Borealis for allowing me to use his Glavenus Day in the Life and modified cutscenes for the video too. Be sure to check out his Monster Hunter documentaries. Thanks to Goji for translating the Glavenus text from the Iceborne book, and especially for clearing up the confusion on the eggs and the young of the Glavenus. And finally, thanks to all the subscribers for their comments, likes and shares on the last video. Good to see many seem to enjoy Celtus and Queen as a change in pace from talking about giant reptiles. Also, Shengeo-Ren is indeed the largest invertebrate, not Celtus Queen. I quite simply forgot about it, as I often do with Shengeo-Ren. Someday soon it may even be turn for the giant mammoth to complete the Fated Four, but as for who the patrons decided on for the next video,